Okay, my partner's back. We're ready when you guys are.
Are both the judges here? Yeah. Okay, cool. Any POIs I prefer to take verbally, and I use she, her pronouns. So if everybody is ready, I will begin my time now. I'm going to super quickly go on definitions, quickly on framework, and then going on to GovCase. If I have time at the end, I'll come back and crystallize impacts, things like that. Definitions: military conscription is essentially forcefully drafting people into the army. There are essentially rules that say every man between, I believe it's 18 and 35, have to go into the South Korean army for at least a couple of years. This exists in South Korea right now. What we are saying we are doing is that the government of South Korea is abolishing this completely. Our framework is just going to be net benefits for the most amount of people. First contention is that military conscription is generally bad. First subpoint under this is individual rights. Tell you that generally people should be able to opt out of military service, and South Korea has imprisoned more conscientious objectors than any other country, and its Military Service Act requires up to 3 years in prison for those who refuse the draft without justifiable reasons. We think that people deserve the right to, if they don't want to serve, we should respect that. Why? Autonomy is good. We think this is the basis for a lot of human rights, that there are certain things we think that everybody should have the right to by the virtue of being human, and therefore government policies should do their best to preserve human autonomy as a human right. Secondly, this provides a slippery slope of setting a precedent of forcing people to do stuff, which gives the government a lot of power over the people, and it's harder to recognize the line between the role of the government and the rights of the individual. Also, religious, moral, and other reasons to object to service are completely legitimate. If it violates someone's beliefs, they shouldn't be forced to go. Again, we should set a precedent for respecting people's moral frameworks, religious frameworks, etc. And people having an individual morality is good, and a sense of right or wrong makes them more likely to act morally. We should preserve this as the government, preserve people acting in the way that they think most morally best, because then they're more likely to do that in other areas of society as well. Also, you can be killed in military service when you're only in the military because of a government mandate. This is morally similar to the government killing this person because they had no choice to go into this army. It is essentially the government is sending its people to die while they have no choice in the matter. We think this is probably also principally wrong. We also tell you that they can make other different contributions to society if they weren't serving in the military. If they don't want to serve, they probably aren't going to make good soldiers anyways, and these people can make legit contributions to South Korea. They can add to the national culture, they can go straight to education, help discover cures for diseases, etc., etc. They're probably way more likely to have national pride when they appreciate that the government respects their individual autonomy as well, and when they can pursue the career path of their choice, are more likely to be more productive and work harder for the South Korean government in general if they feel that the government is reflecting their beliefs and respecting them as people. Also, people are just generally better at jobs that they're passionate at because they spend more time doing it and have learned more about it, and people who voluntarily join the military will help it progress, and people who choose instead to go into science or education will pursue it with a passion, which probably leads to better societal contribution that they wouldn't be making in military service. Also, having objectors in prison is bad. They're not a danger to society, and they should have the right to free speech. Also, we think this is probably contributing to somewhat of an overcrowding of South Korean prison. It's for people that aren't doing anything that should be considered a crime. Therefore, they shouldn't be in prison, and this rule is completely illegitimate. Other subpoint under this is that making people care. We tell you that when people don't care, they don't put effort into training. There's a higher likelihood of putting untrained people onto the battlefield because they don't feel passionate about what they're doing, or maybe they don't even think that it's right. The rate of people who don't want to be in the military in South Korea is fairly high, and somebody messing up in the military can lead to literal death, and one mistake can kill a lot of people. Not having people that are well trained and also want to be there can be detrimental to military service. Even look at Russian soldiers in Ukraine. Because they don't want to be there, they are not doing what the military wants them to do, and this is probably really bad for the Russian military. People not wanting to be in the military generally leads to them not being good soldiers. Second contention is perception. First point, subpoint under this is domestic. We tell you that many people in South Korea have been pushing to get rid of the draft in recent years. A couple statistics: as conscriptions have risen, public attitudes have significantly declined. 42% of South Korean adults said that they supported maintaining the current conscription system, which is a 6% point decrease from 2016, a way larger decrease than we have seen ever in South Korean history. Also, only 43% of South Koreans support shifting to an all-volunteer military, which is an 8% increase from 2016. These are major point increases that we have been seeing in recent years that we haven't seen previously in South Korean nationalism. This means that we are on an upwards trend of people not wanting a conscription military in South Korea. Regardless of statistics, it also makes logical sense that South Koreans are upset with military conscription. There's been a big nationalistic push recently in South Korea, and many people want to establish it more as like a democratic country, right? Part of this is the idea that it's protecting individual liberties and rights, and also other democratic countries recently have been repealing their conscriptions, and South Koreans feel behind on these things. There was also recently a popular Netflix show that made people question the draft, which is once again just like leading to these upwards spirals of people not wanting the draft anymore. In a democratically elected state, it's super important to have public support for politicians if they want to like have public support and be able to pass legislation. This is also going to be an active show of good faith by the government, showing that they like listen to the people, etc. Also, we tell you that in the status quo, people who don't do service face extreme backlash. There's the point is sexism and discrimination, because these people aren't drafted into the military. It is like only men with this super specific age range, and they're seen as like trying to avoid the draft, and people get jealous because they got out while they didn't. And there's general animosity towards like other South Koreans and social disunion. This also uniquely propagates sexism because women aren't drafted, feeding into the idea that women are less capable than the men, etc., etc. There's also the inequity that some people are getting exceptions completely arbitrarily and way too easily manipulated by the government. This gives into the idea that there are too much power to certain people. It makes the whole regime seem super corrupt in the eyes of the people, which leads to even more backlash from people who find it inequitable and like completely arbitrary. Second subpoint under this is like foreign backlash. We tell you that the perception of having mandatory conscription is that they're scared of war or prepping the country for more, and we don't want North Korea seeing this because we want the highest chance of resolution, right? To that North Korea and South Korea have had conflict for like years, and they have a really complicated history. There have been threats of war between the two countries for years, something that would likely be detrimental to the South Korean country for a couple reasons. First of all, they don't have nuclear weapons and North Korea does. This means that an army on the ground is functionally useless if there is war, and it's just harming them because it long-term makes conflict resolution way less likely. And also the military is having like internal issues because it has conflict with like whether the US should have control of its generals and things like that. This internal conflict with like US generals and US control of it could lead to detrimental impacts if we actually went to war and they're still having this internal conflict and can't even figure out how to run the military like from within. North Korea and South Korea have been talking about diplomacy recently with the new South Korean president, something that hasn't been done in many years of the potential conflict. But the issue is that the president is also trying to build up the South Korean military, which North Korea sees as a direct threat to their own peace and sovereignty. And while they have been increasing towards like peace and resolution and things like that, building up the draft has seen, and like building up military has shown North Korea that they think that they're scared of war and they're building up the draft. Getting rid of the draft will be a show of good faith, which makes it way more likely to lead to resolution with North Korea, which is uniquely good for South Korea. For all these reasons, I urge a government ballot. Thank you.
Okay, good speech. Judges, are you guys okay with an off-time roadmap? Okay, sounds good. Quickly, I'm just going to go over the top of case, and then I'll just go on to, neg case. We have 2 contentions or 3 sheets, and then we'll go on to AF case. Sorry, I'm getting my sides mixed up. It's been a long day of long rounds. Okay, is anybody not ready? Okay, my time will begin in 3, 2, 1. Hello, Judge. My name is Monica Goldberg, and I strongly negate the resolution that was previously stated in today's debate round. So I first want to just start off by actually defining what the actual conscription rules are, because it was undefined and kind of misconstrued. I don't think it was on purpose at all. Basically, in South Korea, to maintain a ready fighting source, all men between the ages of 18 and 28 are required to serve 18 months of military service. That's the conscription policy as it is. Okay, that was all I had on top of case. Going into the first contention, which is going to be tagline North Korean pressure. Uniqueness. In the status quo, there is a rough balance between the military forces of North and South Korea. 1. The ROK armed forces are one of the largest and most powerful standing forces in the world, with a reported personnel strength of 3.7 million in 2020. 2. North Korea has been significantly intimidated by the rapidly modernizing and growing army of the South Korea in recent years. 3. Overall, the key interest of North Korean leaders has been to maintain and grow their own power however possible, and they have been intimidated by the size and strength of the South Korean armed forces. 4. Soft power. The South has projected an image of military strength internally and internationally, meaning that North Korea and other potential foes like China are scared of them and unwilling to take decisive military action against them and their interests. 5, which is just kind of under that last point, building up the military from conscription is also a means of deterrence. This is because North Korea knows that there is a consistent influx of soldiers and personnel, which is like, in other words, the military is never going to let up. Links. 1. If the plan passes, South Korea abolishes its military conscription, which results in very few of its youth who are currently coming of age to join the military. So we're seeing a lack of youthful population joining and a lack of an influx of new soldiers. And people are definitely going to leave if they're no longer required. 2, as people age and very few new reservists come into the system, South Korea's armed forces slowly decrease in size until they are a shell of their former presence. And 3, a ban of conscription will show North Korea that South Korea is stepping back from military pressure and will increase South Korea's vulnerability to any threats of war. Internal links. 1, North Korea and Chinese attack, or at the very least, put significant pressure on the South because of its real lack of a standing military force. This results in a very high magnitude conflict with the North, which could easily escalate to a nuclear scale, right? Because my opponents try to say that, like, oh, they have nuclear weapons, so it doesn't really matter if, they don't have a ton of people on the ground. But the thing is, no one wants to go to a nuclear war. You start off on the ground because you don't want to kill entire populations, and because they know we'll end up in mutually assured destruction. 2, sorry, I do not have a lot of time. I'll take it at the end of this contention if I do. 2, South Korea loses a huge amount of soft power globally because it is regarded as a weak and unwilling to protect its own national sovereignty. That results in a significant decrease in the way the country is perceived internally and externally. The impacts is 2. 1, you see the substantial decrease in South Korea's soft power, which results in a decrease in South Korean hegemony. South Korean hedge is uniquely good because it is a democratizing and stable force in the region against less beneficial actors like China, North Korea, and Russia. Thus, these bad actors get more influence in the crucial East Asian region. 2, you see a probable war, which, if the U.S. were to get involved, could easily become nuclear conflict. That war would kill millions of people pretty reasonably and probably, and would also result in the total destruction of basically the entire Korean peninsula. The second contention is on national pride. It's has less greater impacts, but it is still important as it is applied throughout all of South Korea's military. Uniqueness. 1, there are many benefits of military conscription, such as boosting morale. Mandatory national service would fosters unity and brings people from diverse backgrounds together. Compulsory service would save the government money and provide benefits to all of the citizens because performing national service would help young people mature and serve a bridge to adulthood. As of 2014, 56% of adults in South Korea literally supported the conscription. So we're seeing it's actually, and I know you're not supposed to value evidence super high, but you should take into account that the population is literally for this ideology or this idea or policy. 2 is nationalism. People are defending their home and land and participating in solving world peace and helping to protect their family. It is considered the right of manhood in South Korea and bridging the gap between being a child and becoming older. The links. 1, abolishing military conscription will eliminate all of these benefits from the South Korean society. The impact is a worse quality of life from the public. And 2, it's stripping away from a cultural part of South Korea. So Judge, those are 2 disadvantages to their plan. Now, I just quickly wanted to read a counter plan. So I'm sure everybody knows what that is, but basically it's just a competitive policy option that is basically a better way to solve for the affirmations harms. So our plan, my partner will paste in the chat, is that the government of South Korea will reform conscription by creating exemptions for medical, mental, and religious purposes. So the actors can be the South Korean government. The funding is going to be through normal ways and means. It isn't really necessary. And the method implementation is through the how their policy is passed, and the time frame is as soon as possible. So this is mutually exclusive, which means you cannot perm this. They cannot gain benefits to our plan or cancel out the benefits to our plan because you cannot reform a system that is no longer in place, right? Like reform and ban, they're mutually exclusive. So if they try to get up here and perm our CP, just know that that's not possible because you can't reform a system that is no longer in place. Solvency. So 2 points on this. What my opponents bring up is that for 70 years, those who have refused for religious or personal reasons were sent to jail. Nearly 20,000 men have been put behind bars, and the vast majority of them were Jehovah's Witnesses, which is like a nationally protected group. So our plan specifically in terms of reform will create exemptions for any medical reason, religious belief, or mental health issues. This would include people like Jehovah's Witnesses, which are basically what is putting people behind bars. This will not decrease significantly the quantity of individuals conscripted, but will most definitely keep those out of prison, and there are exceptions to conscription. This is not going to be seen to North Korea as some like back down from power, but instead it will be seen as a way to actually benefit the people. Okay, let's go into their case. Then they talk about how military conscription is bad and how it harms individual rights. The thing is, Judge, individual rights often have to be compromised for the collective good, and they're not entirely compromised, right? Like, we're seeing that still some people would probably go to the military anyway, and it's also you're protecting their family, and that's why things like taxes exist, right? Like, we're seeing that people actually, they don't want to pay. It's not necessarily something but they are forced to do it in order for the collective good. I'm sorry, I'm like 2 seconds into protective time. Or like almost there. Then you talk about imprisonment for exemptions. Our CP solves this. They talk about forcing people to do things. This has not existed in the past. This policy has been in place for a while. They say that sense of right and wrong is good. How does forcing people to serve make them less likely to be moral? It's a bad link chain, right? They're actually perpetuating their moral standards in the military by solving to fight for their country and the rights of their country. If anything, it's more liberating. Then they talk about other contributions to society, like add to Korean national culture. North Korea war precludes South Korea from existing, and this is national culture, like I told you before. They talk about how they're not good soldiers. Anyway, they're often perfectly good soldiers. Also, people can engage in these passions after they serve. Things they're passionate about. And they talk about things that people are passionate about. They are protecting their family. They're probably pretty passionate about that. Then they also talk about somebody like messing up can be a problem. Yes, but look at the fact that the ROK soldiers are actually trained and are actually good soldiers. Drafts have been used for almost all of history in big wars or preventing wars and haven't led to these impacts. They talk about Russian soldiers messing this up, but that's because the government is doing inhumane things. They talk about how people don't support it. You can cross-apply our link chain. And about democratic ideologies, almost every democratic country has had conscription in the past. So, Judge, for all of these disadvantages, for our CP solving for their harms, and for my counters on their case, I urge a strong negation ballot. Thank you.
I had a problem hearing other people's POIs earlier this tournament. If I don't say something to acknowledge you, just assume I haven't heard you and you can just say it again. For off-time roadmap, I'm just going to go op case, then gov case. Should be pretty easy to follow. And I'll start my time now. So on opposition's first contention, which is that it puts pressure on North Korea. First of all, I just want to say, even if you don't buy any of the rebuttals I'm about to give you, the thing that they're really missing here is why this is good. Putting pressure on North Korea is not good. Why is this true? Because the autocratic leader in power, Kim Jong-un, has a unique, feels unique pressure by the world to make himself feel powerful and to feel like he's the one in charge of the situation. So even if you buy that, South Korea having this big military is making Kim Jong-un feel specifically threatened, we think that the South Korea growing their military and making Kim Jong-un feel threatened is actually just net bad. It means North Korea is less likely to negotiate with them. It means North Korea is probably likely to grow their own surface, to grow their own nuclear program, to produce more nukes. If they feel threatened, they're going to want to protect themselves against invasion and all that stuff. And see, just Kim Jong-un has a unique individual incentive to feel the most powerful person in the region. We don't think nuclear escalation and having a nuclear power like North Korea developing even more dangerous weapons, we think that leads to net harm. We think that the potential for war there just means with Kim Jong-un having even more weapons of mass destruction is just going to lead to more civilian casualties, more casualties on all sides. Death is bad. This is not a good impact that they're trying to lead to here. Even if you don't buy that North Korea isn't going to react in the way that we know that these countries react, if we're going to look historically, what happened in the Cold War when America developed nukes, Russia also developed nukes. These countries that feel threatened by each other want to maintain a power balance with each other. If North Korea actually does feel threatened by South Korea, this is just net harm. This flows back into our second contention about foreign policy. Weigh that in the context of this debate. But even if you don't believe anything I just told you about their impacts and you think it's good for South Korea to get soft power, here's why North Korea isn't going to be particularly threatened by this. We don't think North Korea has nuclear power and South Korea doesn't. So the fact that South Korea just has technically more people in their army, or they probably actually don't. North Korea is one of the best funded armies in the entire world. The fact that South Korea just has more people, probably means nothing to a country that has nuclear threats, because they know South Korea could never actually protect themselves against a North Korean invasion, because they could just literally nuke South Korea and all of the forces that you have there would be completely pointless. This isn't the type of warfare we're talking about anymore. And furthermore, there are other advancements in warfare, which we tell you are far more important than having boots on the ground or whatever you want to call it. Cyber warfare, all these sorts of things are becoming more and more prevalent in 2022 than actually like World War II style, like boots on the ground, which means we tell you like South Korea isn't actually that threatening or intimidating. Even if you believe that the South Korean army is like really powerful, and they are, and you know, they're a force to be reckoned with, we think like the perception of this is probably going to overwhelm the reality. Like the perception of that region is that China and North Korea are the biggest powers, and that North Korea is probably the most scary after all that like stuff happened with Donald Trump and like the idea that North Korea could like nuke us or whatever. We think the perception is that North Korea is in power in the Union in that area, which means they're not going to get any of their impacts about South Korean soft power. But even if you don't buy anything that I've just told you, here's why South Korea is going to get more soft power on our side than on their side. We tell you soft power comes in a multitude of ways, and it doesn't just come from like having more objective military power, like more boots on the ground. For example, America has a lot of soft power globally because the world trades in the US dollar. We think that like the fact that we would have less people in the military and more people pursuing their passions, working on innovating and stuff like that, that could actually increase South Korean soft power if we have more countries reliant on like South Korean inventions, things that theories and stuff like that that originate in South Korea. All those sorts of things can actually increase South Korean soft power. So even if you buy that this is a big impact in the round, we think we can obviously increase this on our side when we have increased innovation and people doing the things that they're passionate about. They're just going to be better at doing those things, which is just net good for South Korea. Even if the thing you value most is like military engagement, we tell you that the people that are passionate about military engagement are still joining the military on-side gov, and thus you're still going to get the sort of soft power that they talk about, even if that's solely from military forces on there. The most important thing to take away from this is that, like, one, they say that no one wants to go to nuclear war when South Korea is powerful. This is just not true. There's no mutually assured destruction because South Korea does not have nuclear weapons, right? North Korea still knows they have way more power. And two, just go back to what I said at the very beginning. We just think that like if North Korea is indeed threatened by, they see like, oh, the numbers is growing or whatever, mandatory conscription, what are they likely to do? They're going to just up the ante. They're going to start mandatory conscripting. I don't know if they do it already. If they don't, they're going to start pouring more and more money. This is obviously uniquely bad because there's less money for public services, if that even exists in North Korea. And, you know, just making a nuclear power more powerful is bad, not bad for the US and for other countries that want to compete with North Korea and want to stop it from gaining more power. Their second contention is about national pride. They really don't have any warranting here. They just say that this boosts morale. We tell you this is not true in our case. Like, people don't like being forced to do things. People generally have discontent with being told what to do, with being told like your career path is going to have to wait 2 years, and you know, you might die while you're at it, but I'm telling you this is what to do, and so do it. We don't think people generally react well to this. That's why we have conscientious objectors. The statistic that my partner read to you in her speech, those show that almost like 50% of South Korea doesn't want to join the military. They don't support mandatory conscription. Like, we have all the evidence to back up the fact that almost half the country doesn't want to be conscripted into the military. Why on earth would this boost their morale? They talk about like bringing people together from different backgrounds. This is just objectively not true, given the people who aren't conscripted. Like, in the status quo, women aren't conscripted into the army. We think that furthers sexist ideals, right? People who aren't drafted are seen as avoiding the draft. Women specifically, like, it uniquely propagates sexism because women aren't drafted. It feeds into the idea that women are less capable than men, etc. And just in general, people that aren't drafted, we think that this creates a lot of animosity because people are jealous of the people that got exemptions from the military. If Jehovah's Witnesses get exemptions, people are going to be jealous of Jehovah's Witnesses. We think this leads to a lot more animosity and potential societal discrimination against religious people, all these sorts of people that are getting exemptions in the opposition world. Whereas in the government world, if it's not mandatory at all, there's no sort of, this doesn't exist because nobody has anything to be jealous about. They didn't have to go to the military. They just did if they wanted to, and they were passionate about it. And they obviously probably get more respect for their service when it actually wasn't mandatory and it was something they like choose to do. Like in America, when you go into the military, people are like, oh, thank you for serving our country. In countries where conscription is mandatory, that's not true. There's just like a unique harm to people who don't serve because of all this jealousy and animosity. The last thing I want to talk about here when they talk about boosting morale is that just like the objective inequity that's taking place here, the people that get exemptions is somewhat arbitrary. It's way too easily manipulated by the government, which means like some people who feel really strongly that they don't want to go to war, those are conscientious objectors, are still going to be drafted, whereas people who can say they base that in their religious beliefs aren't going to be drafted. Like, again, we tell you there's just huge inequity, and this violates, obviously, people's autonomy to choose what they want to do with their lives. This is something we value. Going into the government case, like, I'll just start right where I left off. They say that individual rights have to be compromised sometimes. We think this is obviously a case in which individual rights just don't have to be compromised. There are plenty of places without mandatory military conscription. They're functioning just fine, and they're valuing individual rights more. We tell you all the reasons why we think this is a good precedent to set. All of these don't really engage with our own warrants about why this protects individual rights, why this propagates all these ideas, why there's more equality in the government world, less discrimination, less hatred, and why the domestic and foreign perception of South Korea improves on government when there's no mandatory conscription. For all these reasons, I strongly encourage a government ballot. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So order is going to be basically negation.
I'm sorry, I think my partner just disconnected. Do you mind waiting like 2 seconds?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, I think we're good now.
Cool. Okay, so quick off time roadmap order is going to be, I don't think there's much on top of case. So I'm just going to go negation flow, counterplan, aft flow. That's going to be the order. And if nobody is not ready, I'll begin my time in 3, 2, 1. Begin. Judge, let's go down the negation flow and address the refutations that they make to our arguments and why their refutations are mostly logical fallacies and completely wrong. First, they talk about North Korean nuclear weapons, meaning that North Korea is not going to be affected by the size of South Korea's military. Basically, their idea here is that North Korea doesn't care how strong South Korea's military is because they have nuclear weapons that protect them from any kind of serious attack. This is true, but they misrepresent what the argument is trying to make. The argument where I'm trying to make is not that South Korea is going to invade the North, but rather that the North is going to invade the South. And the fact that North Korea can rely on its nuclear weapons only makes it more emboldened to invade the South. But also, it knows that any kind of nuclear first strike on the South will result in United States retaliation that will destroy the entire country. And at the end of the day, Kim Jong-un values his life and he values staying in power, so that's an unlikely scenario. Thus, there needs to be a ground conventional war fought for South Korea in which North Korea is going to be significantly advantaged when there are less South Korean boots on the ground, right? So can disregard all their points about how North Korea doesn't care because of its nuclear arsenal. Then on their second refutation about how innovation increases South Korean soft power more than having a big military does. Look at the fact that like 18 months of service for men basically means nothing to South Korea's ability to innovate and to create new products, right? It's like a year and a half of service for half the population. And basically, you can see this in the status quo. Like, look at South Korea and the status quo. Are they technological backwater? No, they're in fact a technological leader. They have plenty of technological innovation. And the point is that the impact of 18 months being served by half the population is going to have to basically zero impact on South Korea's ability to protect soft power abroad. Then they talk about nuclear weapons again. You can cross-apply refutations of that. They say that boots on the ground don't matter anymore. They talk about things like cyber warfare. They say like cyber warfare defines warfare in the status quo. A couple refutations here. First, to develop these new kinds of warfare and to operate them well, you still need people in the military. People in the military, not just infantry, but they take on these kinds of roles like cyber warfare specialists, intelligence officers, whatever they may be, right? That means that South Korea having an additional sort of contingent of military operatives, some of whom may have knowledge about things like cyber warfare, inherently helps them do better in those kinds of conflicts. But on top of that, by the fact that boots on the ground are still necessary, look at the war in Ukraine. Has the war in Ukraine been fought with things like Russian nuclear weapons and Russian cyber warfare? To some degree, it has been fought by Russian cyber warfare, but the vast majority of the war has been fought by soldiers on the ground in a World War II style conflict. And the same thing can be applied to what a potential Korean war would look like, in the sense that you need boots on the ground in order to protect your cities against North Korean invasion. That inherently means then that boots on the ground are an essential part of South Korea being able to protect itself and deter North Korean invasion. They talk about how Kim Jong-un wants, to feel the most powerful leader in the region, and pressure from the world is only going to make him build his military up more. The point here is Kim Jong-un knows that he's not the most powerful leader in the region, right? He's a Chinese puppet, basically. But what he does want to do is expand his own power and influence in much the same way that Vladimir Putin does. And you can look at Putin's invasion of Ukraine as a strong recent precedent for why Kim Jong-un might invade South Korea, right? Think about what he stands to gain. He stands to gain reunification of the country, an enormous amount of wealth and power, and international fear and respect, right? Which are all things that he greatly desires. Sure, I'll take it.
If he cares so much, then why isn't he invaded?
Because of the South Korean military. The South Korean military is so strong that it precludes him from invading the status quo. But the point is, in 50 years, if there are no more South Korean reservists because all the current reservists have gotten too old and you haven't brought enough new people into the military and trained them, then North Korea can just invade. And I told you boots on the ground are important, right? So North Korea just walks in and South Korea falls. That's the whole point of the contention. So basically the idea is, like, Kim Jong-un, like I say, has a strong incentive to invade South Korea, but he's only enabled to do that in the world of the affirmative. And by the fact that that supersedes all other impacts, that supersedes soft power impacts, and that supersedes impacts about the South Korean economy. Because frankly, it does not matter whether you have individual liberty if you're living under North Korean rule. Okay. Continuing down the flow, they talk about how, look, they give you this example of the Cold War. They say the US developed nukes and Russia also developed nukes. That's a totally unfair example, but B, by the fact, again, that, like, again, North Korea is not necessarily worried about their own defense. What they want to do is launch a full-scale invasion of South Korea. And again, we see that this actually does happen in the real world. Look at Ukraine and Putin as a prime example of this, right? So by the argument that this Cold War example means that there's going to be an arms buildup doesn't really make sense, right? And the idea that in the world of the negation, Kim Jong-un is building up his arms more than he would in the world of the affirmation is pretty silly. Okay, on the second contention of national pride, they say that we have no warrantation. I mean, you don't necessarily need much warrantation for this contention. Most of it is just logical reasoning. They talk about how people don't like being forced to do things. Okay, fine. People might not like being forced to do things, but what do people like? Not living under North Korean rule, establishing democratic principles and freedoms, right? Like, look at the fact that most Americans probably don't like to pay their taxes. I probably would not choose to pay my taxes if given the option. But what do I like? All the things that the government provides with my tax money, right? So the fact that people don't like being forced to do things is not warrantation that says that people are not going to support government action, even if it does force them to do things, if that makes sense. I'll get there in a sec. And then they talk about how some people aren't drafted. People are jealous that women don't get drafted. Like, I don't think people in South Korea hold laws against these people, like the fact that they're not forced to be drafted by these kinds of laws. But on top of that, even if you don't buy that, just buy the warrantation that the impact of this is basically zero compared to the other impacts we're considering in the debate. And like the idea that there's rampant sexism and discrimination in South Korea to a great degree in the status quo is just objectively not true. On the counterplan, by the fact that they basically dropped the solvency on the counterplan, and the fact that the counterplan basically solves for the entire affirmative case while not triggering either the disadvantages, right? They talk about like how there's going to be huge inequity and animosity and how they value autonomy. But again, this is a key point, and I'll reiterate it. It is necessary to compromise individual rights, often for the greater good, right? This is why you see things like a draft in World War II. It is necessary to compromise the individual right of the person not to be drafted in order to do things like stop Hitler's Nazi Germany. And in the same sense, it is necessary to draft South Korean people in order to prevent a North Korean takeover of the country, which would result in much worse things for them than being drafted. On the affirmative case, first, again, cross-apply the argument on the top of the case that like individual rights often do have to be compromised. They say there are plenty of places without mandatory conscription that function just fine, yes, but there's no place with mandatory conscription that's functioning just fine that is not under severe threat by a neighboring authoritarian regime who really wants to take over their territory. They talk about how like they imprison people for trying to avoid the draft more than any other country. Again, CP solves. They say they're forcing people to do things. If someone is really being forced to do something in a religious, moral, or in something that's solved by the counterplan, then just buy the counterplan solves for it again. And then on top of that, cross-apply the idea that individual rights need to be compromised sometimes. They say a sense of right or wrong is good. Again, cross-apply my partner's refutation here that how does forcing people to serve make them less moral? There's no link chain there. They say that there's other contributions to society. I already responded to that, cross-apply that. They say they're not good soldiers anyway, and they're not trained by the fact that they are very well trained. They have an 18-month period of serving in the military, most of which is actually training so that they can go into the reserve forces. They say that like somebody messing up could be a problem. Okay, but they're well trained. Cross-apply that warrant. They say the Russian soldiers, again, are messing up. You can just cross-apply what my partner said to that because it wasn't refuted. Then they talk about democratic ideologies by the fact that, again, it's necessary to compromise individual rights, even in a democracy, for the greater good. They talk about how sexism and discrimination means that people are seen as trying to avoid the draft. Again, that there's probably not that much animosity in the country right now. You can look at South Korea as a society right now and see that there probably isn't that much animosity. And they talk about how there's foreign backlash to conscription by the fact that that's just objectively not true. Like, name one country that's getting upset at South Korea right now for trying to defend their own national sovereignty. So for all of those reasons, I urge a strong and decisive vote for the negation. Thank you.
Okay.
I did not. Okay.
Sorry, we are in the same room. Technical difficulties. Okay. I have 4 minutes for a quick off-time roundup. I'm just going to go 2 voter issues, kind of like 3 voter issues, actually. Yeah, and then I'll just go into impact calculus or impact weighing, kind of, and then I'll just do a closing statement. My time will begin in 3, 2, 1. Judge, let's get into the first voter issue and why you'll be voting for the for the negation. Sorry. First on that of morale, which is basically contested, brought up as an affirmation contention and a negation contention. One, they say that people are like going to die and they're going to be dying for their country. We tell you that this is massively outweighed by the fact that conscription is acting as deterrent, so they right now are not dying, and they would be in the affirmation world when North Korea invades in 50-some years. And then talk about how exemptions are going to increase jealousy from Jehovah's Witnesses. These are their ideas about morale. The thing is, the Jehovah's Witnesses are following a religious belief that would compromise their life from a lack of blood. It's not about jealousy. They're fighting for their country. These should just be cross-applied. These ideas, these little minute differences about jealousy or about boosting morale are not important compared to the threat of actual war and political turmoil. When we talk about violating autonomy and democratic ideals, once again, you should really flow through the dropped point about how you're actually helping the greater good. Taxes. Yeah, people do not want to pay taxes, but it's for the greater good. Conscription from World War II. People did not want to fight, but it was for the greater good. And eventually they were happy that they did it. And that's what's happening, right? Because the adults in South Korea, 56% approve this policy, and they're all adults. We're also seeing it's not violating democratic ideals because democratic countries in the past have basically all had conscription at some point or another, but they've all had it during instances of political distress and turmoil, which is what South Korea is in. They talk about how it's not necessary. This is literally contradicting their whole case, right? Because, Judge, if it's not necessary and my opponents claim that it's so bad for South Korea and the people, then why would they be doing it? So it doesn't really make a lot of sense. We give you a lot of reasons as to why this is so important in terms of nuclear war. Okay, let's go to the North Korean pressure, which is probably the highest magnitude impact and the real one that actually matters in today's round, right? My opponent's refutations to this is that less people doesn't matter, right? That's their only real refutation, is that it's nuclear war, it's cyber warfare, doesn't matter. There's 3 main things against this. 1, nuclear warfare is completely off the table because if North Korea uses nukes, the U.S. will just come in and back up South Korea. So that's mutually assured destruction. They're not going to invade nuclearly. It does not make sense for them logistically. Kim Jong-un wants to maintain his power. He's not going to do that. Then on the idea of less people doesn't matter, all those people they're talking about in terms of cyber warfare come from the conscription, right? Those people are conscripted and trained to be medical doctors, trained to be in the military on the ground fighting. They're trained to be in the technical cyber warfare security parts, right? Those people that are drafted make up those people that actually participate in the cyber warfare and the other types of wars that they talk about. Judge, then on the whole idea of this argument, right, it is a massive deterrence. North Korea can't go in nuclearly. Their only chance is by eventually going into the ground. And it's not even just about the fact that the soldiers itself are important. It's the actual message that South Korea is sending, right? They've been building up their military and allies steadily for so many years. Now, all of a sudden, they're just going to back down because some people are a little bit jealous. It's kind of irrational because it will send a national and international message that they are backing away from their military prowess and abilities, right? We're going to be seeing that this is going to cause the likelihood for North Korea to invade once South Korea's influx of new people disappears and the people that are currently in the military get too old to serve. These morale arguments are both offensive and defensive. If you want to, you can call it a wash, but we should be winning on them anyways. But you can, by the fact, completely outweigh them, right? Then on our counterplane, which is basically dropped, we're telling you that we're preventing North Korean pressure, but still allowing but still allowing for people to serve and for South Korea to build up their arsenal. Their counter of jealousy is infinitesimally minute compared to the impact of war and political takeover. So you should buy the fact that our CP is literally solving for the morale boost, the issues that my opponents claim to have with our plan. For all of these reasons, on magnitude, on probability, and for actually helping the majority of the people in South Korea and preventing war, I strongly urge a negation ballot. Thank you.
Okay. If anybody's flowing this, it's going to be like completely off flow in all of the weighing mechanisms. So I would just do it on a different piece of paper. Any rebuttals I have to the MO, I will flag them for you in the speech, but they're just going to be like integrated into the weighing clashes, if that makes sense. And if everybody is ready, then I'm going to begin my time now. First major voting issue in which we win is avoiding war with North Korea. I think both sides agree that this is the highest magnitude impact. And if we can prove that we stop the idea of war of ever happening, then we win, because all of their impacts about the war stop because there is no war in the first place. So which side is actually making war least likely, right? We tell you that North Korea won't go to war if they don't feel threatened. An analogy would be like, why would the US start a war with Mexico unless Mexico started being powerful? The perception in the status quo is that South Korea is not a big power in the region. North Korea and China both have nukes and things like that. Whether or not they use them doesn't matter. North Korea has the upper hand in this situation, and perception is greater than reality. If Kim Jong-un thinks that in the status quo, South Korea is not powerful, but feels like they will be if they keep increasing their military involvement, something he has literally said, and that would give them power, then he will invade because he feels threatened. Inherent op concession that Kim Jong-un is intimidated by the idea of mandatory conscription. If you buy this and nothing else, let's do actor analysis, right? When you feel threatened, do you just say like, oh, well, I feel a little threatened? No, he's going to grow the North Korean military proportionally in response and is way more likely to invade because he feels threatened, because he feels like his power is being threatened. We tell you that recently North Korea and South Korea have been in peace talks since 2018. The threat has been reducing and political diplomacy actually looks likely. This is why they haven't invaded, not because the South Korean army is getting bigger. This changed when the South Korean government tried to increase military in recent years. What would stopping the mandatory conscription be? It would be a show of good faith towards the North Korean government. Kim Jong-un has called the military increasement by South Korea and I quote, unpardonable act of perfidy, which means deceitfulness. He is very upset about this, right? So we tell you that this would be a show of good faith. This would stop him from invading South Korea, which he won't do because we are in peace talks right now. The fact that they are increasing the military is the thing that is stopping these peace talks. If we want peace with North Korea, you have to vote Gov. Why do we win even if they don't have a slightly bigger military? North Korea A has nukes, and they know that South Korea is way more likely to comply because they have the upper hand. And essentially what we are telling you is that North Korea will not invade if we get rid of this threat that South Korea is perpetuating, which we are doing uniquely on Gov. Even if you don't believe literally any of what I just said and you buy their links about the importance of a South Korean army, we can use their own links to show you that passionate people are still going to be a part of the army, and South Korea is still going to have an army. And if there was war, we think probably even more people would likely join. We're not getting rid of the South Korean army. It's still going to exist. So we get these impacts of maintaining the South Korean army with people who have actual passion for the army and want to be there. See our links about why it's better to have people that actually want to be in the army because they're going to be better trained and they're going to have more soul in what they're actually doing, while also getting the possible diplomatic perception about North Korea thinking that South Korea is no longer building up their military. If you buy this, we think we win, because even if you don't believe the perception argument about North Korea, we can still maintain the South Korean army, and we don't have the effects of North Korea immediately winning the war or the effects of public backlash and other impacts that opposition gives you that go widely unresponded to. We tell you that our critique of the draft is the fact that it is forceful. This is the main point that we are removing. We are not getting rid of the South Korean army like my opponents like to try and spin you. Even if you don't believe any of this, we tell you that we still win independently on two other clashes, right? All of the nuclear impact, while high impact, is also very low probability, as my opponents tell you over and over again. Vote on the problems that we know exist on the status quo, and we know that the government solves for with almost complete certainty, because this probability probably outweighs the very unlikely magnitude, right? First point under this is domestic public perception. My opponents read you an old statistic about how people feel about the draft when I read you ones from 2021 about why the public want for the draft has significantly decreased in recent years. But even if you don't believe statistics, I also give you logical warranting as to why this is probably true, right? The idea that they are not behind a fully democratic state. I tell you about the South Korean nationalistic push to become more of a democratic state and to establish itself as a bigger democratic state, and the fact that this draft seems inherently contradictory, especially when other democratic states have recently been getting rid of their military conscriptions. They tell you that people will quote unquote want to fight for their country, but this doesn't apply if they don't want to be in the draft in the first place, and we tell you they probably don't, or at least some people won't want to because they are being forced. If you buy this, we win for a few reasons. First of all, people not liking the draft means that they see the government doesn't care about public perception, And it makes people way less likely to do things that are in the government's interest because they don't like what the government is doing to them. We tell you that people probably also don't like the draft because they want to pursue their careers. This means that all of their impacts they give you about increased nationalism fall when the people feel like they are being forced into something by the government. They're less likely to revolt and things like that when there isn't this public backlash to it. There's also sexism in the military and anger about some people getting an exemption, which is forwarded by their counter plan, which they tell you is giving even more people an exemption. This is increasing social disunity. Even if you don't believe that the public is upset, we tell you that we still win on the principled claim of drafts being bad, right? Why the draft is discrimination. We don't think the South Korean government should be supporting something that is inherently sexist by not drafting women and also is like creating a lot of social disunity. But also there's going to be better military involvement if people actually want to be there. They could be contributing to society in other more important ways. Also, South Korea wants to push a democratically aligned ideology for allyship and other things. And conscription is extremely not necessary right now. But even if you think that we need conscription in the event of a war with North Korea, we don't have that, so we don't need conscription. If later on we needed a draft, that would be totally fine. For all these reasons, I strongly urge a government ballot. Thank you.
Great round, guys.
You as well. Great round.
Yeah, great round.
All right, it looks like both ballots are in. It looks like we both voted for the Gov. Robert, would you like to go first, or would you like me to go first with the RFD?
I don't mind going first if you'd like.
Sure, let's just make sure that all the debaters are here. Menlo, are you guys still here?
Yeah, sorry, we're on one computer together. We're both still here.
Okay, sounds good. Then Robert, whenever you're ready.
So it was a really difficult debate to adjudicate for me. I think one of the problems was that Gov had some pretty interesting arguments in their case that opposition undercovered, and then they kind of disappeared from the flow to some degree. And then they came back in the last speech, and it was just really tough. I think that I mostly voted. I think it was very hard for me to adjudicate like what Kim Jong-un's going to do. Is détente going to work? Easing of tensions? Is doubling down on warfare going to work out? But even in the ops like world, where like having this military stops Kim Jong-un in South Korea, if the soldiers are undertrained, and I don't think that the response, well, 18 months is enough, really cuts the mustard with me without a better description of that military service. I don't know how much of a deterrent they really are. Plus, like the U.S. nuclear backstop seems to be significant enough of a way to stop Kim Jong-un there. I don't have my decision right in front of me. I already posted it. I think that the comment about how it creates disunity in the country itself, people are less likely to support the country when they feel forced to go for it. In the military, I mean, that kind of seemed like true. And I think the other side just saying that, like, you know, for the greater good is great, and comparing it to paying taxes. I think that, like, putting your life on the line is not the same thing as paying taxes. So I don't know. It was really tough. I'm sorry to say it was really tough. And I was thinking it would be a split decision. So I'm really interested what the other judge is going to say.
Yeah, I also thought it was a pretty close round. I think this is, I mean, I usually get pretty long RFDs. This is like kind of a medium length RFD probably. I think on adjudicating the probability of war with North Korea, I think this probably goes a wash, and this is probably the argument that could have won neg the round for me. I think that the arguments from AF about North Korea not wanting mutually assured destruction and the arguments from neg that North Korea could potentially see losing conscription as a sign of weakness both have merit and are weighed out enough that I'm not sure that either side comes out way ahead of the other. I then look at AF's argument about people wanting to be in the army, making better soldiers. I think that's probably true, but I think that neg's arguments that if training is good enough, this probably doesn't matter, that probably wins out just a little bit here. But that's not really where I vote. I think AF wins pretty cleanly on sexism. I think they spend a lot of time talking about the sexist culture that arises from men being forced to serve, and neg's response is about nationalism and like the right of manhood, and combined with the foreign policy arguments that about invasion. I don't think these adequately address this point. I think that while neg's plan to make exemptions more broad is probably a good plan, it doesn't do enough to address the fact that this type of conscription can put people in prison and that it only affects men. I also think that neg focusing on war with North Korea was really smart, but AF was just able to convince me that it's probably just as likely that North Korea wouldn't respond to the repeal of conscription, which is why I think AF won the round. I think if I had just like been thoroughly convinced that war with North Korea would absolutely happen, like this is what they've wanted and nothing could stop them, then sure, maybe I probably could have gone neg. But I think that unless that was the case, it was probably a little bit difficult for neg to win this round, just being completely honest. But I thought it was a really, really good debate. I thought both of us debated really well. Obviously that North Korea point was a huge, huge point in this round. The fact that I couldn't really make a clear decision just based off of that point probably goes to show how good the round was. But I do think like don't allow, as Robert sort of said, like there were a lot of other points that got undercovered because that point was so heavily focused on. And I think when that happens in rounds, it makes it harder for you to win on any of the other points. Either way, I do think that AF did a really, really good job covering things like sexism, and that's why I thought that they had won this debate. But I thought it was a really good round. You guys made it to the end of the tournament, so congratulations. Congratulations on making it to TOC in general, and yeah, hope you guys had a good night.
Thank you, you too.
Thank you so much. Great job, guys. Great job.